The fluorescent lights flickered above the abandoned third-floor bathroom as three seniors cornered what they thought was easy prey. What they didn't realize was that the quiet sophomore they'd been tormenting for weeks wasn't just another victim. He was a state wrestling champion who'd been holding back his entire high school career. Sometimes the biggest mistake bullies make is assuming silence equals weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside High School as Daniel Chen pulled his beat-up Honda Civic into the furthest corner spot, just as he had every day for the past 4 months. At 16, Daniel possessed the kind of quiet presence that made him nearly invisible in the crowded hallways of a school with over 1,800 students. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches with a lean but deceptively strong build, he moved through the world with careful deliberation, his dark eyes constantly observing while his mouth rarely opened except when absolutely necessary. Most of his classmates at Riverside knew nothing about Daniel beyond the fact that he'd transferred from Sacramento at the beginning of sophomore year. They saw a kid who ate lunch alone, never raised his hand in class despite clearly knowing the answers, and seemed to shrink into himself whenever attention turned his way. What they couldn't see beneath his deliberately loose-fitting clothes was a physique sculpted by 12 years of wrestling training. What they couldn't know was that in his previous school, Daniel had been a 3-time state champion who dominated opponents twice his size with technical precision that left coaches speechless. The decision to keep his wrestling background secret hadn't been difficult. After his father's job transfer forced the family to relocate, Daniel's mother had suggested a fresh start might be exactly what he needed. The pressure of being a teenage wrestling prodigy had begun wearing on him during his freshman year in Sacramento. Constant expectations, reporters calling for interviews after matches, college scouts attending his competitions, it had all become overwhelming for someone who just wanted to be a normal kid. So when enrollment paperwork asked about previous athletic participation, Daniel had simply left those sections blank. When coaches approached him about trying out for various teams, he politely declined. When classmates asked about his interests, he gave vague answers about reading and video games. For the first time in his life, Daniel Chen was anonymous, and initially, he'd found that freedom intoxicating. The illusion of peaceful anonymity lasted exactly 6 weeks. Trevor Matthews first noticed Daniel during third-period American history, though noticed might be too generous a term. What Trevor saw was opportunity dressed in thrift store clothes and timid body language. At 18, Trevor stood 6 feet, 2 inches tall with the kind of broad-shouldered, thick-necked build that came from 4 years of high school football. His sandy brown hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes expensive enough to announce his family's wealth, and his smile carried the particular cruelty that developed in teenagers who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. Trevor ruled Riverside High's social hierarchy through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and carefully cultivated connections. His father owned the largest construction company in town, employing many of his classmates' parents, which gave Trevor a kind of inherited authority that extended far beyond the school walls. Teachers overlooked his occasional outbursts because his family donated generously to school programs. Administrators ignored complaints about his behavior because challenging Trevor meant challenging one of the community's most powerful families. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late September. Daniel had been walking to his locker after chemistry class when Trevor deliberately stepped into his path. The collision sent Daniel's textbooks scattering across the hallway floor, while Trevor barely shifted his weight. "Watch where you're going, transfer boy," Trevor said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. His 2 constant companions, Brad Wilson and Connor Hayes, laughed appreciatively at the performance. Daniel knelt to gather his scattered belongings without making eye contact or responding verbally. Every instinct developed through years of competitive wrestling screamed at him to react, to show this oversized bully exactly what happened when someone tested a trained fighter. Instead, he forced his breathing to remain steady and his movements calm. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. But Trevor wasn't finished. As Daniel reached for his calculus textbook, Trevor's foot came down on the cover, pinning it to the floor. "I said watch where you're going. Didn't your parents teach you manners, or were they too busy running a laundromat?" The racial slur hit Daniel like a physical blow, but still he didn't react. He looked up at Trevor with eyes that revealed nothing, gently pulled his textbook free, and stood without a word. The hallway had filled with students watching the exchange, their faces showing mixtures of amusement, pity, and uncomfortable recognition of injustice they weren't willing to confront. Daniel walked away, leaving Trevor standing in the hallway with his cruel grin intact and his audience properly entertained. What Daniel didn't see was the flicker of frustration that crossed Trevor's features when his target failed to provide the satisfying reaction he'd been seeking. From that moment, Daniel became Trevor's project. The harassment followed a predictable escalation pattern that Daniel recognized from anti-bullying presentations he'd sat through in previous schools. It started small and seemingly accidental. A shoulder check in crowded hallways that sent Daniel stumbling into lockers, accidentally knocking his lunch tray out of his hands in the cafeteria, throwing crumpled paper at the back of his head during classes when teachers weren't looking. Brad Wilson proved to be Trevor's most enthusiastic accomplice. Standing nearly as tall as Trevor but carrying significantly more weight, Brad possessed the kind of mean-spirited humor that found genuine joy in others' discomfort. He'd taken to calling Daniel China Boy, despite knowing his family's Korean heritage, and seemed to delight in making stereotypical comments about Asian students being good at math and bad at sports. Connor Hayes served as the group's lookout and social media coordinator. Shorter than his friends but making up for it with nervous energy and a smartphone constantly ready to record, Connor had begun documenting their harassment of Daniel for their private group chat. Videos of Daniel picking up scattered books, photos of him sitting alone at lunch, memes mocking his quiet demeanor, all shared among Trevor's extended circle of followers. The psychological warfare expanded beyond direct confrontation. Daniel's locker was frequently decorated with sticky notes featuring crude drawings and offensive messages. His email inbox filled with anonymous messages ranging from mild insults to detailed threats. Social media accounts were created using his name and photo, posting embarrassing fake confessions and inappropriate comments that other students would screenshot and share. Through it all, Daniel maintained his silence. He arrived at school each morning with the same neutral expression, endured whatever harassment the day brought, and went home to lose himself in homework and the wrestling videos he watched obsessively on YouTube. His parents noticed his increasingly withdrawn behavior, but attributed it to normal adjustment difficulties that came with changing schools. The truth was that Daniel's restraint was beginning to crack under constant pressure. Every night, he lay in bed replaying confrontations and imagining different outcomes. He visualized using a simple double-leg takedown to put Trevor on his back. He pictured the look of shock on Brad's face when the quiet Asian kid demonstrated exactly how wrong stereotypes could be. He dreamed of Connor's phone clattering across the hallway floor as its owner discovered what real consequences felt like. But each morning, Daniel would remember his mother's words about strength and walking away. He'd think about the fresh start they'd wanted for him, about the peace that came with anonymity. He'd force himself to believe that ignoring the bullies would eventually make them lose interest and move on to easier targets. October arrived with the first hints of autumn chill, and with it came an escalation that pushed Daniel's self-control to its absolute limits. Trevor had apparently grown frustrated with his target's refusal to provide satisfying reactions. The harassment became more direct, more personal, and more difficult to ignore. During fourth period English literature, Trevor began making increasingly loud comments about Daniel's appearance, intelligence, and family background. Mrs. Rodriguez, their teacher, seemed either oblivious to the disruption or unwilling to confront one of the school's most influential students. When Daniel tried moving to a different seat, Trevor and his friends would shift positions to maintain their harassment campaign. The cafeteria became a daily gauntlet of humiliation. Trevor's group would time their movements to accidentally bump into Daniel while he carried his lunch tray, resulting in spilled food and ruined clothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd throw food at his back when he sat alone, then act innocent when he turned around. They'd loudly speculate about his family's immigration status and make jokes about deportation that drew uncomfortable laughter from nearby tables. Physical education class presented the worst challenges. Coach Patterson ran his gym classes with military precision, but seemed to have a blind spot when it came to Trevor's behavior. During basketball games, Trevor would deliberately foul Daniel hard, enough to send him sprawling across the court. During flag football, he'd use excessive force in tackles despite the non-contact rules. During wrestling unit, ironically the one sport where Daniel could have dominated, Trevor made sure to pair himself with Daniel for demonstration purposes, using the opportunity to apply holds with unnecessary aggression while Coach Patterson praised his intensity. Daniel endured each incident with the same stoic silence that had become his trademark. His jaw would clench slightly when Trevor whispered threats during partner exercises. His hands would form brief fists when Brad made particularly crude comments about Asian stereotypes, but he never responded verbally or physically. Other students began to whisper that maybe something was wrong with the quiet transfer student. Maybe he was on medication that made him emotionally numb. Maybe his family had taught him to be passive in the face of aggression. The whispers hurt almost as much as the direct harassment. Daniel had spent years being respected for his athletic achievements and quiet leadership. Coaches had praised his mental toughness and competitive spirit. Teammates had looked up to him as someone who could be counted on in crucial moments. Now his classmates saw him as either pitifully weak or strangely indifferent to his own dignity. November brought the incident that would change everything. Daniel had been having an unusually good day. He'd aced a calculus test that morning, managed to eat lunch without harassment thanks to Trevor's absence for a dentist appointment, and even contributed to a class discussion about The Great Gatsby that earned approving nods from Mrs. Rodriguez. For the first time in weeks, he'd begun to think that maybe his strategy of patient endurance was finally working. The illusion shattered during 7th period study hall. Daniel had requested a bathroom pass and made his way to the 3rd floor restroom, a location he'd chosen specifically because it was rarely used during class periods. The bathroom was older than the main facilities, with flickering fluorescent lights and graffiti-covered stall doors that the maintenance staff seemed to have given up trying to clean. Most students avoided it, preferring the newer restrooms on the 1st and 2nd floors. Daniel was washing his hands when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Something about the rhythm, multiple people walking together with deliberate purpose, made him pause and listen. The footsteps stopped directly outside the bathroom door. Trevor entered first, his usual confident smirk widening when he spotted Daniel at the sink. Brad followed close behind, his bulk filling the doorway and blocking the only exit. Connor slipped in last, immediately pulling out his phone to begin recording what they clearly expected to be memorable entertainment. "Well, well," Trevor said, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Look what we found hiding up here. China Boy's secret bathroom." Daniel's reflection in the mirror showed a face that remained carefully neutral, but his eyes had begun to harden in a way that none of the 3 bullies noticed. He turned off the water slowly, deliberately, buying time to assess the situation while his mind automatically shifted into the tactical thinking mode that had served him so well in wrestling competitions. 3 opponents, 1 exit blocked, confined, space that would limit their ability to use superior numbers effectively, hard surfaces that could cause serious injury if someone fell wrong. No teachers or witnesses nearby to intervene or document what happened. For the first time since starting at Riverside High, Daniel found himself in a situation where walking away wasn't an option. "What's the matter, transfer boy?" Brad added, stepping closer while Connor adjusted his phone angle to capture Daniel's face. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just don't speak English that good." The grammatical irony wasn't lost on Daniel, but he remained silent while calculating distances and positioning. Trevor had moved to his right, blocking access to the paper towel dispenser, but leaving the hand dryers clear. Brad stood directly in front of the door, his weight shifting from foot to foot in nervous anticipation. Connor had positioned himself in the corner for the best camera angle, assuming he'd remain safely out of any physical confrontation. "You know what I think?" Trevor continued, emboldened by Daniel's continued silence. "I think you're just scared. I think you've been scared this whole time, and that's why you never fight back. That's why you just take it like a little girl." Daniel's hands had been resting on the edge of the sink, but now his grip tightened slightly. Years of wrestling training had taught him to read body language and anticipate attacks, skills that were screaming warnings as he watched Trevor's posture shift into something more aggressive. "Maybe we should test that theory," Trevor said, taking another step closer. "Maybe we should see just how scared little China boy really gets when there's nowhere to run." The racial slur combined with the obvious threat finally penetrated Daniel's emotional armor. For months, he'd endured harassment by telling himself it was temporary, that ignoring the bullies would eventually make them lose interest. But looking at their faces now, Trevor's cruel anticipation, Brad's eager malice, Connor's excited voyeurism, Daniel realized they had no intention of stopping. They'd cornered him not for any specific reason beyond their own entertainment, and they were prepared to escalate as far as necessary to get the reaction they craved. Something fundamental shifted in Daniel's mind. The careful control he'd maintained for months began to crack, releasing glimpses of the competitive fire that had made him a state champion. His breathing changed subtly, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, transforming from defensive to balanced. His eyes, which had spent months avoiding direct contact, now locked onto Trevor's with an intensity that should have served as a warning. But Trevor was too intoxicated by his own perceived dominance to recognize danger signals. "I asked you a question, freak," Trevor snarled, reaching out to grab Daniel's shoulder. "Are you scared?" The moment Trevor's hand made contact, every instinct Daniel had suppressed for months exploded into action. But instead of the violent eruption his tormentors expected, what happened next was something far more devastating. Controlled, technical precision applied with surgical accuracy. Daniel's right hand moved with lightning speed, clamping down on Trevor's wrist with a grip strength developed through years of grappling. His left hand shot to Trevor's elbow, controlling the joint and setting up what every wrestler recognized as a classic arm drag setup. Before Trevor could process what was happening, Daniel had stepped to the side and pulled the bigger boy forward, using Trevor's own momentum against him. Trevor stumbled forward, suddenly off balance and completely unprepared for the level of technical skill he was encountering. He'd expected either continued passivity or wild, undisciplined swinging. Instead, he found himself being controlled and manipulated by someone who clearly understood leverage, timing, and body mechanics at a level that suggested serious training. "What the hell?" Trevor began, but Daniel wasn't finished. Using the arm drag to step behind Trevor, Daniel immediately transitioned into what wrestling coaches called a perfect penetration step. His right leg drove deep between Trevor's legs, while his left hand maintained control of the trapped arm. His right hand snaked around Trevor's waist, fingers interlocking to complete a textbook rear body lock. Brad and Connor watched in stunned confusion as their leader was suddenly being controlled by someone they'd dismissed as helpless prey. Trevor's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious panic as he realized he couldn't break free from Daniel's grip despite having significant advantages in size and weight. "Let me go," Trevor demanded, his voice cracking slightly with the first notes of genuine fear he'd experienced in years. Daniel's response was to demonstrate why wrestling was often called human chess played at full speed. Instead of releasing the hold, he shifted his weight and executed a perfect lift, raising Trevor completely off his feet before driving him down in a controlled takedown that sent the bigger boy crashing to the tiled floor. The impact echoed throughout the bathroom like a gunshot, followed immediately by Trevor's grunt of pain and surprise. He found himself flat on his stomach with Daniel's weight settled across his back, one arm trapped beneath his body and the other being controlled by techniques he didn't understand but couldn't escape. "Oh my God," Connor whispered, his phone capturing footage he'd never expected to record. "Trevor's getting destroyed." Brad took a step forward, his loyalty to Trevor overriding his growing realization that they'd severely miscalculated their target's capabilities. "Get off him." Daniel's head turned toward Brad with the same calm expression he'd maintained throughout months of harassment, but now there was something different in his eyes. Something that made Brad hesitate mid-step as he suddenly understood that the quiet kid wasn't just lucky, he was trained. "You want some too?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite his position, controlling Trevor on the floor. It was the first time in months that he'd spoken directly to his tormentors, and the calm confidence in his tone was more unsettling than any shouted threat could have been. Brad glanced at Connor, who was still recording but had backed further into his corner, clearly having no intention of getting physically involved. The dynamic that had seemed so clear moments earlier, three strong seniors intimidating one weak sophomore, had been completely reversed in less than 30 seconds. Trevor was still struggling beneath Daniel's control, his face red with exertion and embarrassment as he discovered that none of his strength training or football experience had prepared him for this type of combat. Wrestling was a sport built on leverage and technique, where size advantages could be neutralized by superior skill and conditioning. Daniel had both in abundance. "I said let me go," Trevor repeated, but his voice now carried undertones of desperation rather than command. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, demonstrating how completely he controlled the situation. "I've been trying to let you go for months," he said conversationally. "You're the one who wouldn't leave me alone." The bathroom fell silent, except for Trevor's labored breathing and the distant sound of classes changing periods somewhere in the building. Connor's phone continued recording, capturing footage that would soon change everything at Riverside High School. For Daniel, the moment represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. 4 months of careful restraint and strategic patience had been shattered by 3 bullies who'd pushed too far. The wrestling champion he'd tried so hard to hide was emerging whether he wanted it to or not. But as he maintained perfect control over Trevor's struggling form, Daniel realized something surprising. He wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had been building for months had been replaced by something else entirely, the cold, focused clarity that had made him nearly unbeatable in competition. These weren't opponents worthy of his anger. They were simply problems to be solved with the appropriate application of technique and control. The real confrontation was just beginning. The transformation happened in an instant. Brad Wilson had seen enough wrestling matches on television to recognize when someone was in serious trouble, and Trevor Matthews was definitely in serious trouble. The quiet sophomore who'd never fought back against months of harassment had just executed takedown that belonged in a professional competition, not a high school bathroom confrontation. I'm warning you, Brad said, trying to inject authority into his voice while taking another step toward Daniel. Let him go right now, or you're going to regret it. Daniel's response was to smoothly transition from controlling Trevor's back to something called a crossface cradle, a position that wrestling coaches taught as both a pinning combination and a demonstration of complete dominance. Trevor found his head trapped against his own knee, while Daniel's arms created an unbreakable cage around his torso. The position was uncomfortable enough to be painful, but controlled enough to avoid causing actual injury. "Stop recording, Daniel," said quietly to Connor, who was still holding his phone with trembling hands. "And put that away before I decide you need to join your friend down here." Connor's thumb hovered over the stop button, torn between his fear of Daniel and his loyalty to Trevor. The footage he'd captured was already beyond anything he'd expected, showing their supposed victim systematically dismantling the school's most feared bully with techniques that looked borrowed from Olympic competition. "Don't you dare stop filming," Trevor managed to gasp out, though his voice was muffled by his awkward position. "My dad's going to sue this freak's family into bankruptcy. You're all witnesses to assault." Daniel's grip tightened slightly, demonstrating how much more pressure he could apply if he chose to. "Assault?" he asked conversationally. "You mean like when you grabbed my shoulder without permission? Or like when you three-cornered me in here with no way out? Because I'm pretty sure I'm just defending myself." The legal implications of the situation were beginning to penetrate Brad's anger-fogged mind. He'd watched Trevor initiate physical contact, had heard the threats and racial slurs, had participated in blocking the exit. If this footage ever reached administrators or police, the three seniors weren't going to be seen as victims of an unprovoked attack. "Look," Brad said, his tone shifting from threatening to negotiating, "maybe we all just got a little heated. Here, Trevor didn't mean anything by grabbing you. Why don't we just call it even and walk away?" Daniel considered this proposal while maintaining perfect control over Trevor's struggling form. 4 months of harassment, dozens of humiliating incidents, countless nights lying awake planning revenge fantasies, and now they wanted to call it even after 30 seconds of experiencing what real helplessness felt like. "Even?" Daniel repeated, thoughtfully. "You think 30 seconds of your friend being uncomfortable makes up for months of making my life miserable?" Trevor tried to respond, but found that Daniel's grip made talking difficult without cutting off his own air supply. The wrestling hold was designed to control without causing permanent damage, but it required cooperation from the person being held. Fighting against it only made the position more uncomfortable. "Besides," Daniel continued, "I don't think we're even close to even yet. See, Trevor here likes to pick on people he thinks can't fight back. But now he's finding out what it feels like to be completely helpless, and I don't think he's learned his lesson yet." Connor's phone captured the moment when Trevor's struggles became more frantic as the reality of his situation fully sank in. The bathroom's harsh fluorescent lighting cast dramatic shadows that made Daniel look larger and more imposing than his actual size, while Trevor appeared diminished and vulnerable despite his superior height and weight. "What do you want?" Brad asked desperately. "You want an apology? Fine, we're sorry. We're all sorry. Just let him up." Daniel's laugh was quiet, but carried an edge that made both standing boys take involuntary steps backward. "You're sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because your friend is currently learning what helplessness feels like. But you're not sorry for spending months making a stranger's life miserable, just because you thought you could get away with it." The accuracy of Daniel's assessment hung in the air like an accusation. Brad and Connor exchanged glances that confirmed the truth of his words. Their apologies were strategic, not sincere, motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. "Please," Trevor whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I can't breathe." Daniel immediately loosened his grip slightly, demonstrating the kind of control that came from thousands of hours of training with partners who depended on his ability to apply pressure without causing harm. You can breathe. Fine, he said calmly. You're just not used to being in a position where someone else controls whether you're comfortable or not. The psychological impact of the statement was devastating. Trevor had built his identity around being the one who controlled others, who decided when interactions began and ended, who determined the rules of engagement. Now he was trapped in a position where his comfort depended entirely on the mercy of someone he'd dismissed as weak and insignificant. You know what the funny thing is? Daniel continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone despite the intensity of the situation. I actually tried to avoid this. For months, I let you push me around because I thought maybe you'd get bored and move on to someone else. I thought maybe if I just kept my head down and didn't react, you'd eventually realize there were easier targets. Connor's phone continued recording, though his hands were shaking badly enough to make the footage unsteady. Part of him wanted to stop filming, to pretend this was all a misunderstanding that could be forgotten. But another part recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in Riverside High's social hierarchy. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Daniel asked, applying slight pressure to emphasize his point. You had to keep pushing. You had to see how far you could go before I broke. Well, congratulations. You found my breaking point. Brad was frantically trying to think of some way to de-escalate the situation that wouldn't involve admitting defeat or calling for help. Summoning teachers would mean explaining why 3 seniors had cornered 1 sophomore in an isolated bathroom, which would lead to questions about their previous behavior toward Daniel. Fighting Daniel was clearly not an option given what he'd just demonstrated against Trevor. We get it, Brad said desperately. You're tougher than we thought. You made your point. Trevor's learned his lesson. We all have. Daniel's head tilted slightly as he considered this claim. Have you? Because I don't think you understand yet. See, you guys have been operating under the assumption that being bigger and louder makes you stronger, that having friends and family connections makes you untouchable, that picking on quiet kids is safe because they won't fight back. Trevor tried again to break free from the hold, putting all his strength into a desperate attempt to escape. Daniel rode out the struggle with minimal effort, his positioning and leverage making Trevor's size advantage irrelevant. When the bigger boy exhausted himself, Daniel was still in complete control, barely breathing hard from the exertion. The thing is, Daniel continued as if Trevor's escape attempt hadn't even registered, you never bothered to find out why I was quiet. You just assumed it was because I was weak or scared. But there are different kinds of quiet. There's quiet because you're afraid, and there's quiet because you're disciplined. Connor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you talking about? Daniel's smile was slight, but genuinely amused. I'm talking about the fact that I've been holding back this whole time. See, I used to wrestle competitively. Started when I was 4 years old. Made varsity as a freshman at my old school. Won state championships 3 years running before my family moved here. The revelation hit the 3 bullies like a physical blow. Suddenly, Daniel's technical precision made sense. The effortless way he'd controlled Trevor, the confident calm he maintained despite being outnumbered, the way he spoke about discipline and control, it all pointed to someone with serious martial training. State champion? Brad repeated weakly. You're making that up. Daniel's response was to smoothly transition Trevor into a different position called a chicken wing, trapping the bigger boy's arm behind his back while maintaining control of his head and neck. The move required precise timing and positioning that couldn't be faked or improvised. Daniel Chen, he said matter-of-factly, Sacramento Regional Wrestling Association. You can look it up. 3-time state champion in the 152-pound weight class, undefeated record my junior year before we moved. I was being recruited by Division I colleges before I decided I wanted a normal high school experience. Trevor's attempt to process this information was interrupted by the realization that his arm was now trapped in a position that could easily become painful if Daniel chose to apply more pressure. Every movement he made only seemed to give Daniel better control, as if the smaller boy was anticipating his reactions before he made them. "So when you guys decided to make me your pet project," Daniel continued, "you weren't picking on some helpless victim. You were harassing someone who could have put any of you in the hospital on the first day if I'd wanted to. The only reason I didn't was because I was trying to leave that part of my life behind." Connor's phone captured the moment when the full implications of Daniel's revelations sank in. The months of harassment they'd thought were demonstrations of their dominance had actually been displays of Daniel's restraint. Every time they'd pushed him around, he'd been choosing not to retaliate rather than being unable to defend himself. "But you couldn't let me be normal, could you?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying genuine disappointment. "You had to keep pushing until you forced me to show you who I really am. Well, here we are. This is who I am when I stop holding back." Brad was beginning to understand that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The quiet transfer student they'd been tormenting wasn't weak or scared. He was a trained fighter who'd been showing them mercy they hadn't recognized or appreciated. "We didn't know," Brad said frantically. "We had no idea. If we'd known you were some kind of champion wrestler, we never would have." "Would have what?" Daniel interrupted. "Left me alone? Found an easier target? The only reason you're sorry is because you found out I can defend myself. If I was just some regular kid with no training, you'd still be perfectly happy making my life miserable." The accuracy of this assessment was undeniable. Brad and Connor had participated in Trevor's harassment campaign without any concern for Daniel's well-being or feelings. Their current remorse was entirely self-interested, motivated by fear rather than genuine recognition of wrongdoing. Trevor had stopped struggling and was now lying still beneath Daniel's control, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his miscalculation. For months, he'd been provoking someone capable of ending their confrontations at any time. Someone who'd been choosing peace over violence, despite having every skill necessary to defend himself. "Please," Trevor said quietly, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I didn't know." Daniel considered the apology while maintaining his hold. "You're sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because you're currently helpless. But are you sorry for spending months making another human being miserable just because you thought you could get away with it?" The question hung in the air without an immediate response. Trevor was being forced to confront the ugliness of his own motivations, to acknowledge that his behavior had been driven by cruelty rather than any justifiable cause. "Yes," Trevor finally whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it. The names, the shoving, following you home, everything. I'm sorry." Daniel studied Trevor's face carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus strategic manipulation. Years of competitive wrestling had taught him to read people under pressure, to distinguish between authentic emotion and performance designed to achieve specific goals. "I think you are sorry," Daniel said finally. "Sorry you picked the wrong target. Sorry your friends are seeing you helpless. Sorry that footage exists of you getting dominated by someone half your size. But I don't think you're sorry for being a bully. I think you're just sorry you got consequences." The psychological precision of Daniel's analysis was devastating. Trevor found himself unable to argue because the assessment was fundamentally accurate. His regret was situational rather than moral, focused on his current predicament rather than his previous actions. "What do you want from us?" Connor asked, desperately, still filming but clearly hoping for some way to end the confrontation that wouldn't involve further humiliation. Daniel's answer came after a long pause during which he seemed to be weighing various options. "I want you to understand something. For the past 4 months, I've been choosing not to hurt you. Every time Trevor shoved me, every time Brad made his little jokes, every time you filmed me being humiliated, I was making a conscious decision to absorb that, treatment rather than respond with violence. He shifted his weight slightly, reminding Trevor of exactly how helpless his current position was. But that was the old Daniel, the one who thought he could just blend in and be normal. The one who thought bullies would eventually get bored and move on. That Daniel is gone now. Brad swallowed hard, recognizing that they were witnessing the emergence of someone fundamentally different from the quiet boy they'd been tormenting. What does that mean? It means, Daniel said with calm certainty, that if any of you ever bother me again, if you harass me or anyone else, if you so much as look at me wrong in the hallways, I'm going to remind you exactly how this felt. And next time, I won't be nearly as gentle about it. The threat was delivered without raised voice or dramatic gesture, but its impact was unmistakable. Daniel wasn't making an empty promise or engaging in teenage bravado. He was stating a simple fact about cause and effect, delivered with the confidence of someone who had both the ability and willingness to follow through. But more than that, Daniel continued, I want you to think about why you became bullies in the first place. What hole in your personality were you trying to fill by making other people miserable? What weakness in yourselves were you trying to hide by attacking someone you thought was weaker? Trevor found himself facing questions he'd never seriously considered. His bullying had always seemed natural, justified by social hierarchies and unspoken rules about dominance and submission. The idea that it might stem from his own insecurities was uncomfortably novel. I want you to understand, Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of months of suppressed frustration, that every time you made me feel small, you were actually revealing how small you are inside. Strong people don't need to hurt others to feel powerful. Confident people don't need to tear others down to build themselves up. Connor's phone continued capturing what had become less a physical confrontation than a philosophical education, delivered by someone who'd earned the right to speak about strength and weakness through demonstrated superiority. Finally, after what felt like hours but had been less than 10 minutes, Daniel smoothly released Trevor and stood up in one fluid motion. The bigger boy remained on the floor for several seconds, partly from exhaustion but mostly from the psychological impact of realizing how completely he'd been controlled. Get up, Daniel said simply. Trevor struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and exertion. Standing side by side, the size difference between the two boys was obvious, making Daniel's domination even more impressive and humiliating. Now, Daniel said, his voice returning to the quiet tone his classmates had grown accustomed to, you're going to walk out of here and never bother me again. You're going to stop harassing other students who can't defend themselves. And you're going to think very carefully about what kind of person you want to be for the rest of high school. Trevor nodded frantically, eager to escape the situation with whatever dignity he could salvage. Yes, absolutely, we're done. All of us. Daniel's gaze shifted to Brad and Connor, who immediately voiced their agreement. Never again, Brad promised. We swear. Good, Daniel said. Because if I hear about you bothering anyone else, if I see you picking on freshmen or targeting quiet kids, I'm going to assume you didn't learn anything from today. And then we'll have another conversation that won't be nearly as pleasant as this one. The three seniors moved toward the bathroom exit with obvious relief, eager to put distance between themselves and their former victim. But Daniel's voice stopped them before they reached the door. One more thing, he said calmly. Delete that video. Connor's hand tightened protectively around his phone. The footage represented both evidence of his friend's humiliation and proof of Daniel's unexpected capabilities. But delete it, Daniel repeated, his tone carrying quiet authority that brooked no argument. All of it. Right now. Connor looked to Trevor for guidance, but the bigger boy was clearly in no position to make demands. With obvious reluctance, Connor pulled up the video and hit delete, erasing several minutes of footage that would have changed social dynamics at Riverside High School in ways none of them could predict. Thank you, Daniel said politely. Now you can go." The three bullies filed out of the bathroom in complete silence, leaving Daniel alone with his reflection in the grimy mirror. The quiet sophomore who'd entered the bathroom 20 minutes earlier had been transformed into something else, entirely not through violence or anger, but through the calm application of skills he'd spent years developing and months trying to hide. As Daniel washed his hands and straightened his clothing, he reflected on the fact that his carefully constructed anonymity was now completely shattered. By tomorrow, word would spread throughout Riverside High about what had happened in the third-floor bathroom. Students would whisper about the quiet transfer student who demolished Trevor Matthews without breaking a sweat. Teachers would look at him differently. Coaches would start asking questions about his athletic background. The normal high school experience he'd wanted was officially over, replaced by something that might be much more complicated, but would definitely be more honest. Daniel Chen, 3-time state wrestling champion, was no longer hiding in plain sight. And for the first time since transferring to Riverside High, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The news traveled through Riverside High like wildfire, though the details became more distorted with each retelling. By the end of the day, whispered conversations in hallways painted Daniel Chen as everything from a secret martial arts master to an undercover professional fighter. The truth was somehow both simpler and more remarkable than the rumors suggested. Trevor Matthews spent the remainder of the school day in uncharacteristic silence, avoiding eye contact with classmates who had grown accustomed to his loud, domineering presence. The confident swagger that had defined his personality for 4 years had evaporated, replaced by careful, measured movements that suggested someone suddenly aware of his own vulnerability. During classes, he found himself studying Daniel from across rooms, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming figure with the technical fighter who had effortlessly controlled him in the bathroom. Brad Wilson and Connor Hayes maintained their distance from both Trevor and Daniel, uncertain how to process what they had witnessed. The social hierarchy they had understood for years had been completely upended in less than 15 minutes, leaving them adrift in unfamiliar territory where their previous assumptions about strength and weakness no longer applied. Daniel, meanwhile, continued attending classes with the same reserved demeanor he had maintained for months, though perceptive observers might have noticed subtle changes in his posture and presence. He sat straighter in his chairs, made more direct eye contact when teachers addressed him, and moved through hallways with a fluid confidence that seemed to command space around him. The transformation was internal as much as external, born from the relief of no longer hiding fundamental aspects of his identity. The first person to approach Daniel directly was Jessica Martinez, a junior who had witnessed some of Trevor's harassment campaigns without ever finding the courage to intervene. She caught up with him after 6th period chemistry, matching his pace as he walked toward his locker. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "About you being some kind of wrestling champion?" Daniel paused, considering how much of his background to reveal. The secret he had guarded so carefully was already leaking out through rumor and speculation. Perhaps honesty was the simpler path forward. "I used to compete," he said carefully, "before we moved here." Jessica's eyes widened with curiosity, and something that might have been respect. "Why didn't you ever say anything? Why let Trevor and his friends treat you like that for months if you could have stopped at any time?" The question touched on complexities Daniel was still processing himself. "Because I wanted to be normal," he said finally. "I wanted to see if I could just be a regular student without wrestling defining everything about me. I thought maybe, if I didn't react, they would eventually lose interest." "But they didn't," Jessica observed. "No," Daniel agreed. "They didn't." Word of the confrontation reached Coach Patterson by the end of the school day, though the details that filtered back to him were contradictory and probably exaggerated. What seemed consistent across all versions was that Daniel Chen had demonstrated wrestling skills that went far beyond casual familiarity with the sport. Patterson, who had coached high school wrestling for 15 years, decided direct inquiry was preferable to speculation. He found Daniel in the parking lot, loading textbooks into his Honda Civic with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. "Mr. Chen," Coach Patterson called out. "Could I have a word?" Daniel straightened, recognizing the tone of someone seeking official answers to unofficial questions. "Sure, Coach. I've been hearing some interesting stories about you today," Patterson said carefully. "Stories about wrestling experience that might have been left off your enrollment paperwork." Daniel met the coach's gaze directly. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that suggest you might have more athletic background than you've mentioned. The kind that make me wonder why someone with serious wrestling training chose not to try out for our team." For a moment, Daniel considered deflecting or minimizing his experience. The habit of concealment ran deep after months of careful anonymity. But the events in the bathroom had already shattered his cover, and continuing to hide seemed both pointless and exhausting. "I wrestled competitively for 12 years, Daniel said simply. 3-time state champion in Sacramento. I was being recruited by Stanford and Iowa before my family moved here." Coach Patterson's eyebrows rose significantly. Stanford and Iowa represented the pinnacle of collegiate wrestling programs, the kind of schools that only recruited athletes with exceptional talent and proven records. "And you chose not to compete here because?" "Because I wanted a break," Daniel replied honestly. The pressure was getting intense. The expectations, the media attention, the college scouts at every match. "I thought maybe I could just be a normal student for a while." Patterson nodded slowly, understanding flooding his features. He had seen promising young athletes burn out under pressure, had watched teenagers struggle with the weight of others' expectations. But something changed today. It wasn't a question, and Daniel didn't treat it as one. Some things you can't walk away from forever. Sometimes circumstances force you to remember who you really are. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Kim, the student council president and one of the few students at Riverside who commanded respect across all social groups. She approached with purpose, her expression mixing curiosity with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "Daniel," she said without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Coach Patterson recognized the tone of someone conducting an unofficial investigation and decided to excuse himself. "Think about what we discussed, Mr. Chen. The door is always open if you change your mind." After the coach departed, Sarah fixed Daniel with a stare that suggested she had already drawn conclusions and was seeking confirmation rather than information. "Did Trevor Matthews and his friends corner you in a bathroom today?" Daniel considered his response carefully. Sarah Kim wielded considerable influence at Riverside High, and her opinion could shape how the incident was perceived by the broader student body. "They initiated a confrontation," he said diplomatically. "And you defended yourself." "I protected myself from a situation they created." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Good. Trevor's been a problem for years, but his family's connections made him essentially untouchable. Maybe this will finally teach him some consequences." The revelation that Trevor's behavior was widely recognized but rarely challenged added another layer to Daniel's understanding of Riverside's social dynamics. His months of harassment hadn't occurred in a vacuum, but as part of a pattern that had been enabled by institutional reluctance to confront influential families. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Word is spreading that you have some serious athletic background. Wrestling championships, college recruiting, that kind of thing." Daniel nodded confirmation. "It's true." "Then I have a proposition for you," Sarah said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "Our school's wrestling program has been struggling for years. Last season we had more forfeits than wins because we couldn't field full lineups. Coach Patterson is a good man, but he's working with limited talent and even more limited resources. She paused, studying Daniel's reaction before continuing. But if someone with legitimate championship credentials joined the team, if we could start winning matches and maybe even competing at regionals, it would change everything. More funding, better equipment, renewed interest from students and parents. Daniel had not expected to find himself recruited for the very activity he had been trying to escape. I came here to get away from competitive wrestling. And I understand that, Sarah said. But sometimes we have obligations that go beyond our personal preferences. You have a gift that could benefit not just yourself, but an entire program, an entire school community. The conversation was taking on philosophical dimensions that made Daniel uncomfortable. He had spent months trying to blend into anonymity, only to have a single confrontation thrust him back into the spotlight he had been avoiding. I need to think about it, he said finally. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's all I ask. Just consider the possibility that your talents might be meant for something larger than personal satisfaction. As Sarah departed, Daniel found himself alone in the parking lot with thoughts that refused to organize themselves into coherent patterns. The day had begun with his carefully constructed anonymity intact and was ending with that identity completely shattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as classmates and teachers adjusted their perceptions of who he was and what he represented. The drive home provided time for reflection without interruption. Daniel had succeeded in keeping his wrestling background secret for 4 months, but the effort had required constant vigilance and considerable sacrifice. He had avoided physical education activities that might reveal his conditioning, had deflected questions about his interests and hobbies, had presented himself as academically focused to the exclusion of athletic pursuits. The deception had worked until circumstances made it impossible to maintain. Now faced with the aftermath of that revelation, Daniel was beginning to question whether the anonymity had been worth the cost. His parents noticed the change in his demeanor immediately upon his arrival home. The withdrawn, cautious teenager, who had been trudging through his days for months, had been replaced by someone who moved with visible confidence and spoke with clearer purpose. Something happened today, his mother observed during dinner. Something significant. Daniel had been dreading this conversation, but knew it was inevitable. His parents had supported his decision to step away from competitive wrestling, but they had also watched him struggle with the adjustment to life without the sport that had defined his identity for over a decade. There was a confrontation at school, he said carefully. Some students who had been bothering me for months pushed things too far. I had to defend myself. His father, a software engineer who had spent countless hours driving Daniel to tournaments and watching him compete, leaned forward with interest. And they found out about my wrestling background. Word is spreading throughout the school. His parents exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their understanding of what this development meant for their son's carefully planned normal high school experience. How do you feel about that? His mother asked gently. Daniel considered the question seriously. Relieved, I think. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Maybe a little scared about what comes next. The wrestling coach will probably approach you, his father observed. He already did. And the student council president wants me to consider joining the team to help rebuild the program. Another meaningful glance passed between his parents. They had always been supportive of his athletic pursuits, but had equally supported his decision to step away when the pressure became overwhelming. Now they found themselves in the position of watching him navigate the path back to something he had worked so hard to leave behind. What do you want to do? His mother asked. The question struck at the heart of Daniel's internal conflict. For months, he had wanted nothing more than anonymity and normalcy. But the events of the day had reminded him of aspects of himself he had forgotten during his attempted transformation into an ordinary student. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me misses it. The competition, the training, the sense of purpose. But another part of me remembers why I wanted to quit in the first place. His father nodded understanding. The Daniel who walked away from wrestling isn't the same Daniel who might choose to return to it. You've had time to process the pressure and develop perspective on what the sport means to you versus what others expected it to mean. The insight resonated with Daniel in ways he hadn't anticipated. His decision to stop competing had been driven largely by external pressures and expectations that had made wrestling feel like an obligation rather than a passion. But returning to the sport now would be entirely his choice, motivated by his own reasons rather than the demands of coaches, scouts, or media attention. Over the following week, Riverside High School settled into a new equilibrium that reflected Daniel's changed status within the social hierarchy. Trevor Matthews maintained his distance from everyone, spending lunch periods alone and avoiding the areas where he had previously held court with his followers. Brad Wilson and Connor Hayes had similarly retreated from their roles as enforcers, uncertain how to operate in a social landscape where their former victim had been revealed as their superior in every meaningful measure of strength. Other students began approaching Daniel with mixtures of curiosity, respect, and requests for stories about his competitive background. He answered questions politely but without elaboration, maintaining the reserved demeanor that had always been natural to his personality while no longer feeling the need to actively hide his athletic identity. The transformation extended beyond social dynamics to academic performance as well. Teachers who had previously seen Daniel as a capable but unremarkable student began recognizing signs of the focus and discipline that had made him successful in wrestling. His class participation increased, his assignment quality improved, and his overall engagement with the educational process reflected someone no longer expending mental energy on maintaining a false identity. Coach Patterson approached him twice more during that week, each time with increasing urgency as he recognized the opportunity Daniel's presence represented for the struggling wrestling program. The conversations remained respectful and pressure-free, but the coach's genuine enthusiasm for the sport and his concern for his current athletes were persuasive in ways that aggressive recruiting might not have been. The decision ultimately crystallized during an incident that occurred the following Friday afternoon. Daniel was walking toward the parking lot when he witnessed a scene that transported him back to his own months of harassment. Two sophomores had cornered a freshman near the bike racks, engaging in the kind of systematic intimidation that Daniel recognized as a precursor to more serious bullying. Without conscious decision, Daniel found himself intervening with the same calm authority he had discovered in the bathroom confrontation with Trevor. The sophomores, already aware of his reputation, immediately backed down when he suggested they find something more productive to do with their time. The freshman, a thin boy named Marcus who reminded Daniel of his former self, looked up at his unexpected protector with gratitude and confusion. "Why did you help me?" Marcus asked, as they walked toward the school building together. Daniel considered the question carefully. "Because someone should have helped me months ago, but they didn't. And because I realize today that hiding from who you are doesn't protect anyone." The insight felt like a revelation even as he spoke. Yet his months of attempted anonymity hadn't prevented bullying at Riverside High. They had simply ensured that when it occurred, no one with the ability to stop it was willing to get involved. By concealing his capabilities, he had abdicated responsibility for using them constructively. That evening, Daniel called Coach Patterson and informed him that he would be trying out for the wrestling team. The conversation was brief but electric with mutual excitement as they discussed practice schedules, team dynamics, and the upcoming season's potential. Monday morning brought Daniel's first practice with Riverside High's wrestling team, a collection of enthusiastic but largely inexperienced athletes who had been struggling against better-funded and more successful programs throughout the region. Coach Patterson introduced him simply as a transfer student with significant competitive experience, allowing Daniel's abilities to speak for themselves rather than creating unrealistic expectations. The first live wrestling session provided immediate demonstration of the gap between Daniel's skills and those of his new teammates. Without appearing to exert significant effort, he controlled and dominated training partners regardless of their size or experience level. His technique was crisp, his conditioning superior, and his understanding of strategy sophisticated in ways that suggested years of high-level competition. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the athletic department that Riverside High's wrestling program had acquired a legitimate championship-caliber athlete. Coach Patterson found himself fielding calls from other coaches and administrators who had heard rumors about Daniel's background and wanted confirmation of his credentials. The team's transformation was immediate and dramatic. Athletes who had grown accustomed to moral victories and narrow defeats suddenly found themselves training alongside someone who expected to win and knew how to make it happen. Daniel's presence elevated not just the competitive potential of the program, but the seriousness with which everyone approached their preparation. More importantly for Daniel himself, returning to wrestling felt like reclaiming essential aspects of his identity that he had mistakenly believed were burdens rather than gifts. The physical demands of training provided outlets for energy and focus that had been missing from his academic routine. The team environment offered camaraderie and shared purpose that his months of isolation had made him forget he valued. The first dual meet of the season took place 3 weeks later, against a regional rival that had dominated Riverside for several consecutive years. Daniel competed at 152 pounds, the same weight class where he had won state championships in Sacramento, against an opponent who entered the match undefeated for the season. The bout lasted less than 2 minutes. Daniel's technical superiority was evident from the opening whistle as he systematically dismantled his opponent's offense while building toward a pin that came with surgical precision in the second period. The Riverside crowd, unaccustomed to dominant wrestling performances, erupted in appreciation for artistry they were witnessing for the first time. After the match, Daniel was surrounded by teammates, coaches, and fans who wanted to share in the celebration of a victory that felt like vindication for years of disappointment. For the first time since transferring to Riverside High, Daniel felt genuinely integrated into the school community rather than merely tolerated as an outsider. The season that followed exceeded everyone's expectations, except perhaps Daniel's own. Riverside's wrestling program, which had forfeited more matches than it won the previous year, compiled a winning record and advanced to regional competition for the first time in over a decade. Daniel finished the season undefeated, earning recognition as the region's outstanding wrestler and attracting renewed interest from the college programs that had recruited him in Sacramento. More significantly, the success of the wrestling program created ripple effects throughout Riverside High's culture. Students who had never attended athletic events began showing up for wrestling matches. The administration increased funding for equipment and travel expenses. Younger students began expressing interest in joining the program, seeing success as achievable rather than impossible. Daniel's transformation from anonymous transfer student to celebrated athlete was complete, but the change had brought wisdom rather than mere recognition. He understood now that his abilities carried responsibilities beyond personal achievement, that his success could inspire and elevate others in ways that his previous isolation never could. Trevor Matthews eventually approached Daniel near the end of the school year, months after their bathroom confrontation had altered both their trajectories. The conversation was awkward but genuine, with Trevor offering apologies that seemed motivated by genuine remorse rather than strategic self-interest. "I've been thinking about what you said," Trevor admitted, "about why I felt the need to hurt people. I started seeing a counselor, trying to figure out what was wrong with me that made me think that was okay." Daniel listened without judgment, recognizing that Trevor's journey towards self-awareness was as significant as his own return to wrestling. "What did you learn?" "That I was scared," Trevor said simply. Scared of not being important, scared of people not noticing me, scared of being ordinary. So I made sure people feared me instead of respected me, because fear felt safer than risking genuine connection. The insight was more mature than Daniel had expected from someone he had dismissed as simply cruel. And now I'm trying to figure out how to be someone worth respecting instead of someone people are afraid to cross. Daniel nodded approvingly. That's harder work, but it's better work. As his junior year drew to a close, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him from anonymous outsider to integral member of the Riverside High community. The path had required abandoning carefully constructed defenses and embracing aspects of himself he had tried to suppress. But the result was a more authentic and satisfying existence than his attempted anonymity had ever provided. The bathroom confrontation that had seemed like a disaster at the time had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. By refusing to remain a victim and choosing to use his abilities constructively, Daniel had transformed not just his own high school experience but the culture of an entire athletic program and the lives of teammates who had learned what winning felt like for the first time. Standing in the wrestling room after the final practice of the season, surrounded by teammates who had become genuine friends and looking ahead to senior year opportunities that seemed limitless, Daniel understood. That strength wasn't something to be hidden or apologized for. It was a responsibility to be embraced, a gift to be shared, and a foundation upon which meaningful connections and lasting achievements could be built. The quiet transfer student who had once absorbed harassment in silence had evolved into someone who used his voice and abilities to protect others and elevate everyone around him. It was exactly the kind of person he had always been capable of becoming once he stopped running from who he really was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.